Hi, everyone. Hello, and
Hello.
welcome to our talk on Mademoiselle de Malepeire by Fanny Reybaud. We are so pleased today to see all of you. Thank you for joining us. I'm Renee Saito, Director of the Library, and joining us today is Translator Barbara Basbanes Richter, who is the founder of In Ink Ghostwriting. And she's also features editor of Literary Features Syndicate and a columnist for Fine Books and Collections magazine. And she's also, in addition, she's earned her master's degree in French literature at Tufts University and is a former French and Latin educator. And I didn't mention, she's also a member of the National Book Critics Circle. And in conversation with Barbara is Randy Williams, who is former president of the Alliance Française de Chicago, and he's a Chevalier in the Order of Arts and Letters and the National Order of Merit. Randy Williams first volunteered with the library 23 years ago. So we will start off shortly, but first a few instructions on using Zoom for this meeting. Please put your microphone on mute. Please keep your microphone silent until you're invited otherwise. And please communicate with us via the chat line. And you'll find the chat line at the bottom of your screen where you see some symbols. It's in the middle and it says chat. And a friend will write bonjour there and it'll pop up, you'll find it. You'll be able to post your questions there and we will share them. We're very interested in hearing what you have to say, so be sure to write in the chat. And with that, I introduce Randy, who will be in conversation with Barbara.
Well, I'm going to try not to be in too much conversation because Barbara's fascinating. I think the most interesting part of this experience has been the chance to get acquainted just a little bit, as well as reading the book. Barbara, you have a beautiful photo here. I'm sure it is a photograph. I'm not sure whether it's a photo of Fanny or of Mademoiselle de Malepeire, but we'll leave that to you. I think we'd like to start with kind of an overview of what the book is. And I will confess I am an inveterate spoiler, so I'm not going to say too much about it because I think the Publisher Weekly blurb said it's a mystery thriller, which I think may be overstating the case, but there are certainly some, for me, some surprises in it. So I guess I'd describe it as a book about a painting that is an important piece of three periods separated by about 30 years apiece. And after that, I promise to keep quiet and let you tell the world what this book is and why you got fascinated with it.
Good. Well, so to answer your first question, who is this person on the cover? Well, it's neither, I guess. It's actually a self-portrait of Madame Lebrun, who was a painter who was a niece of Charles Lebrun. But it's nice because it does evoke, as you very astutely point out, a painting is at the centerpiece of this book. So I'm also going to try and not give too much away. I'm going to assume that most folks who are here today, thank you also very much for joining. And thank you, Alliance Française of Chicago, for hosting me. That's fantastic. That we get to talk about this wonderful little jewel together. But I'm going to try and not give away too much. So what I hope to do is to share with you a little bit about Fanny Reybaud, the author, about whom I found there's very little known in English. There's some about her in French. But when she was alive, when she was writing, she was, to use the modern term, she was a bestseller. She wrote books that people loved and that people also reviewed favorably. So sometimes even today, you have this balance between if you're a bestseller, but also do you have literary merit? And she actually, I would argue, found both. She found that happy medium. So today we'll talk a little bit about her, and then I have a few slides that I'd like to share with you about some of the books that actually appear within this book, because one of the main themes in this Mademoiselle de Malepeire is you have a woman or young woman who is led astray, you could say, by reading banned books, which I think is just marvelous. So Randy, shall I get into the overview of Fanny?
Yeah, please do, but I will take that opportunity to point out to our audience. I read this on Kindle because I didn't want to wait for a delivery, but I think the print is just as good. Your footnotes are absolutely fascinating because they tell us, you give so much background about what's happening and the history that makes the reading of this much richer.
Thank you for saying that. The footnotes were as much a labor as the translation, and in no small part because understanding that this book, we'll get to that with the translation bit, is for people living now in 2021. And when it was originally published in 1854 and 1855, a lot of the references that appear in this book would have been common knowledge. And for us, even if you have a background in French literature, they can be a little obscure. So I'm actually very happy to hear that. So thank you. Now back to Fanny. How did I discover this lady in the first place? Well, as you pointed out, I was in grad school way back when. I won't give you the date. And I was in a course on George Sand, who perhaps you've heard of George Sand, the fellow female literary giant who is known to us today, and who's really was a large figure in the Romantic Gothic movement. And our professor gave us this actually, this is the actual dog-eared volume that I had back then, actually coffee-stained volume. And she said, read this real quick. We'll talk about it tomorrow. And just as a counterpoint to what we're talking about. So we read it, and naturally, as I'm ashamed to say, I read it a little too quickly in preparation for the next class, but I felt that the language sparkled. It's so clean and different from George Sand. That was the overarching theme that we were talking about, but I also knew at that point that she deserved a greater appreciation on my end. So a couple of years later, I came back to it, I reread it, I fell in love with it again, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to translate it? So that's where that came from. But in terms of how well Fanny Reybaud, the author, is known in this book, not very well known, even in France. This particular edition in French that I was working from was published by Actes Sud in 1990. So already that's over 30 years ago. So not really well known today, except for in a couple of academic circles. And the material that exists on Fanny Reybaud really is actually limited to the work done by one professor in Aix-en-Provence named Yvonne Knible, and I'm probably butchering her last name, and I apologize. I believe she's in her 90s, but she's really done a lot of work on Fanny Reybaud and her various texts. And where she got a lot of her information from is from this wood pulp piece of pamphlet called Les Cahiers d'Aix-en-Provence, which was published in 1924 in Aix-en-Provence. And there's a little biography in there by a man named Charles Delanglade, who was a friend of the family attorney, who apparently had access to some documents that were left by Fanny. She died in 1870. He accessed them. He wrote this little biography. A lot of Fanny's primary documents have since disappeared. So we're working with secondary material in terms of reconstructing Fanny's life for the most part. So I'm basing my knowledge on those materials. So who was Fanny? Let's get to it already. Yes. So she was actually born in 1802. Her full name, it's wonderful, it's Josephine Antoinette Henriette Fanny Arnaud Reybaud. So that's her full name when she was married. So she was born without the Reybaud on December 15th, 1802 in Aix-en-Provence to a very well-established family. Her father was a doctor and her mother was landed, I guess you could say, it was bourgeoisie. They owned tanneries, they owned flocks of sheep. They actually owned a mill in Protestant, which is outside Aix-en-Provence, if you ever get to go. Now it's home to a chocolate factory, which is all the more reason to go. Fanny's maternal grandfather was a surgeon. He was actually the king's surgeon in Aix, and as you can imagine, with the French Revolution, that was not a good title to have. So he fled. He went to London. He emigrated to London in 1792, and he took with him one of his brilliant students, Henry Arnaud. Henry ultimately becomes the father of Fanny, but he goes in 1792 with his instructor, his professor. Instead of going to London, he goes to fight with Napoleon. He fights brilliantly at the Battle of Marengo, and he returns a hero. And eventually, Dr. Arnaud returns as well. They reconcile. Arnaud says, "You should marry my daughter." And Henry says, "Of course, I'll marry her." So they get married. Henry is brilliant. He's tolerant, which is unusual at the time. He talks to people on both sides of the political aisle, so to speak. He's the son-in-law of an emigre. So a lot of people in Aix would come to Henry to adjudicate conflicts. And actually, this was a point of contention with Henry's young bride, Thérèse. She didn't like to share her husband with the world. And so domestic bliss, was fleeting. And Fanny's parents separated in 1804. And actually, unusually, Thérèse, she left the family and she went to a family house in the outskirts of Aix. And they divorced, which they could do at the time, which is not the case for Fanny later on. Interestingly, Fanny hasn't got kind words for her mother in the existing correspondence. Later on, she calls her mother gloomy and bitter. And actually, if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see that the mother-daughter dynamic is rather strained as well. So we can surmise that she used that as inspiration for this here. When Fanny was a young girl, she was sent to a Carmelite convent, which was not unusual for women or for young girls of her age and social stature. She was there for 8 years, and she learned the art of storytelling from these Carmelite nuns. She also developed a habit of daily journal writing, which she kept up until the very end of her life in 1870. And it's clear that this experience left a very powerful impact on Fanny. Convents, not necessarily in this book, but in other of her works, feature very prominently as places of contemplation and are important to the pieces. In this book, you don't have so much of the convent element, but the stories of the people and the place of Aix-en-Provence were very certainly shared with her by these nuns. So when Fanny leaves, she goes back to her father in 1819. Since in her absence, he turned his home, his salon, into a meeting house for young liberals who were opposing the Second White Terror of 1815, which was another political movement. But here, very importantly, as during this era for movers and shakers, if you will, she met people who would become instrumental, lifelong friends who would help her with her literary career down the line. Eventually, she goes to Marseille, also in the south of France, because at the time, in the 1820s, Aix-en-Provence was kind of a backwater, to use that phrase. It was charming, it was lovely, but if you wanted to meet people and you wanted to do things and maybe find a good husband, you go to Marseille, which is what she did. She had some uncles there, and they introduced her into the right social circles, and she was apparently gorgeous. I have been unable to find any existing portraits or engravings of her, but the existing literature suggests that she was stunning. And she was possessed of a great mind, so she was the total package, to say the least. And she meets Charles Reybaud, who was the heir to a sugar factory, which makes sense. In Marseille, you had the great port, so you had the sugar trade going back and forth. Actually, Charles's older brother, Louis, had eyes for Fanny, but Fanny chose the younger brother. And in a classic coup de foudre, they met, and then they met in 1822. I think they wed a couple months later, and then they had their son, Émile, in 1823. They set up home in Marseille, and Charles was all set to be a lawyer. He was going to open his practice, but was not to be, because Charles never got used to the fact that he was married. He was a bit of a skirt chaser. He was a bit of a gambler. And there are some letters that exist that you can actually consult at a museum in Aix-en-Provence, where Fanny expresses her disappointment in her relationship with her husband. She describes how verbally abusive he is to her, how demeaning he is, and how she's getting to this point where she can't take it anymore. And interestingly enough, her mother, who divorced her father 20 years earlier, comes to Marseille and counsels Fanny on maybe trying to keep the marriage alive, which must have run a little hollow for Fanny, because her mother had not been able to do the same. So ultimately, Fanny does leave. She goes back to her father in Aix-en-Provence, but this being an era where divorce was not legal, she could not legally obtain a divorce. She could separate, but Charles still had, they were still married in the eyes of the law. And though Charles did not want to go follow her, he actually went off, traveled into the East. He went to Brazil and went to all these different places. He set his brother Louis to take charge and to keep an eye, so to speak, on Fanny so that she wouldn't meet other men or do anything that he didn't approve of. So that had to be very stifling, to say the least, to have a man that she didn't marry, keeping an eye on her at all times, could not have been comfortable. And she was still wedded to Charles, so that also limited her in what she could do, where she could go, and things of that nature. So interestingly, in the fall of 1825, she goes back to Aix-en-Provence, and it snows in the winter, which is unheard of. It snows once in a blue moon. And she revels in the snow, and next couple of days she starts coughing up blood, which is concerning. And her father, being a doctor, checks her out and says, this is a circulation issue. You should go to the mountains and it'll clear up. She clearly thought it was due to her unsatisfying relationship. Today, we know that it was tuberculosis, or we can surmise pretty confidently that it was. And this ailment, so she survived it, but it would plague her later on in her later years. And she talks about, interestingly, in her journals that she keeps from this time, how she suffered and now her body was rejecting her as well. And she feels alone in the world. So what does she do? She turns to writing at night, alone, without any encumbrance. And she starts writing, and she writes to some friends that actually she doesn't like women who write. She finds them, what are they trying to do by sharing their written work with the world? It's an interesting position that she's trying to maintain. But ultimately, she does decide that she'd like to publish her work. And she goes to one of her friends, Adolphe Thiers, she goes to François Mignet. Adolphe Thiers was president of the Third Republic, but François Mignet was a longtime friend of Fanny. And Fanny shows him her work, and he says, this is great, you should try publishing it. And so in 1827, she publishes her first book, or her first book is published, which is called La Protestant. And it was a total failure. She wrote it to mimic Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott was a huge influence at the time on writers, and he was translated into French. And it seems that Mignet said, try and write a book in his style, which she did. And it was, I think, 500 pages. It was heavy, it was dense, and it didn't sell well. But she was undeterred. She wrote another book called Hélice de Sceaux, which appeared in 1834. And that was also a total failure. So you would think after two that she would want to give up, but she did not. And so what does she write about? She decides to, I think, refocus, right? These two volumes where she's trying to imitate somebody else don't work out. So she looks to her environment, and her environment is the south of France. It's Provence. It's, if you look over to Spain, it's the Pyrenees. And so in the 1830s, you had these insurrections going on along the Pyrenees, and there was a rebellion that took place. And at the same time, you had this wave of Hispanophilia throughout France. So she picked up on that and said, well, if people are interested in what's happening in Spain, maybe I should write this. Of course, I'm assuming this, but that this would be an interesting story. So she wrote a book that was published in 1836, which translated into English was called The Adventures of a Renegade Under His Dictation. So in theory, this piece of fiction is a soldier who's recounting his adventures in Spain. And it was a smash, and it was short, and it was crisp. And this is the first book where we really get a sense of Fanny developing her style. So her persistence paid off. And from there on out, the public could not get enough of her writing. And she obliged, and she turned out books in short order. She turned out, I think, 3 other books between 1836 and 1842. Don't quote me on the dates, but it was pretty quick. And actually, she and her husband, their relations warmed. They became a little bit more friendly, to say that you could say that about your estranged husband. And she went to Paris. She's toured the literary circuit. She delighted everyone that she met. And her major piece, really, I think that where you find the best of Fanny is in Mademoiselle de Malepeire, which was published in 2 issues of La Revue des Deux Mondes, 1854 December and January 1855. And in this piece, you have, within 130 pages, really, you get a taste of what Aix was like, Aix-en-Provence was like. You get an insight into a woman who's trapped, who tries to escape in one way or another. And you have a fascinating examination, I think, of social structures and how they exist and how they changed. And that's, I hope we'll talk a little bit about what's in the book today, just to kind of wrap up Fanny's life. So she continues to write books up until about 1860, where she seems to get sick again, which was, I believe, caused by her TB. She doesn't write anything new between 1860 and when she dies in 1870. However, Louis Hachette Publishers, gets a hold basically of her back catalog, so to speak, and publishes her hits, her greatest hits, so to speak, in a new line called Bibliothèque des Chemins de Fer, which were a series of cheaply printed books that were available to train travelers. So she was up there with all of the big authors and sold apparently pretty well. She died in 1870, and really very little fanfare to make of it. There was a war going on. Her son predeceased her, her estranged husband predeceased her, and her literary effects were left with a niece who left Provence, never to be heard from again. The correspondence that remains really is thanks to the pieces that are in the museum in Aix-en-Provence and letters that she sent to her contemporaries. So we're kind of piecing together her life based on less than ideal circumstances, but maybe it warrants a trip to Aix-en-Provence and go digging a little deeper.
Well, I think over the years, I've prided myself on, people say, what's your favorite French literature? And I always say, oh, it's 19th century. And I love the 19th, but it was a total surprise that this is an author I'd never heard of.
Right.
And you kind of wonder why. Was it because she published the original Roman de Gare? I mean, was she a second class, or is she just because she was a woman, or is it because she was from Aix? She wasn't from Paris, or why was she overlooked?
Why is she overlooked? And I think that goes back to who champions you when you're gone. And also George, so if we're going to compare, for example, to George Sand had a tremendous interest in preserving her thoughts. And you can go and buy her correspondence, for example, with Flaubert. It's like a 3-volume set. It's copious. So there was a concerted effort on her part to preserve that. I don't know. One, I don't know that was the case with Fanny, just because there isn't enough to make that determination. And two, since her only son died before her, really there was nobody there to carry on the legacy. And in one of her early letters, she actually, I think I mentioned this briefly, she talks about where she's got this ambivalence for other women who deign to write. And that's not unusual, because in the early 19th century, women who wrote, women who participated in the public forum were scorned, which was this huge backlash after the French Revolution. You have the French Revolution, which just jolts, the entire Western world and changes how we think and interact with one another. But then under Napoleon, you have this return to a sort of glorified maternity, where a woman's role was really at home next to the foyer, right, and rearing your children. And so she was doing that, but she was also interested in exploring her literary talents. So she was trying to balance those two things. Now, my question is, was she writing this letter as cover for, I can't believe women are doing this, but yet I just can't help it, I'm going to publish anyway? Yeah. Which is interesting, I think, also because in her first books, she didn't publish under her own name, she published under pseudonym. And she used her mother's maiden, it was like one of these passwords that you use today. It was her husband's name and her mother's maiden name. So it wasn't even that she was a woman. And then actually this book, if you go and look at it, look for it on Amazon or any of the other outlets, it's not by Fanny Reybaud, it's by Madame Charles Reybaud.
Oh.
So even though she acknowledges for this publication that yes, she's a woman, yes, she wrote it, she's still, you know, Madame Charles Reybaud and not Fanny Reybaud.
Well, it's kind of it's a transition to translation. My theory, I first read your version and I thought this is so interesting and it's so modern that it must be the translation. And so then I went back and read the original French and it also seemed modern and so different from what I expected from the middle of the 19th century. So I thought maybe that was why she was out of sync, but then you say she was very popular. And so let's go to translation. I'm always impressed that the Man Booker, the International Man Booker now actually divides the award between the translator and the author, because those are modern books where the author's still alive and kicking. And as I told you, I was going to use it. I just read another interesting recent book on translation with a funny title, Dancing on Ropes. But the author says it's almost impossible to translate verbally and well at the same time. And this applies to you, Barbara. Translators must simultaneously work towards several goals: to get the message across and not to break certain constraints, to stay upright and to maintain flexibility. To keep everything in balance, they constantly move between these near impossibilities, and the world moves with them. So you've done that. Tell us how you do that. How do you go about translating?
Well, so it's certainly not linear. And actually, when I started this project, which really was just for whether I could do it, I had no assumptions, I guess, like Fanny, whether it would go anywhere or not. But I had read recently, so I guess this was in 2016 when I started, Nabokov wrote in The New Republic back in 1941 his feelings on the sins of the translator. He goes through 3 sins that he feels that most translators commit. And I read it, and there is an art to it. And I think, and what he talks about, and what I basically agree with, I think is totally spot on, is you do need to have an understanding of both cultures. Beyond language, not just in modern culture, but with a text like this, going back and understanding what was going on in that place at that time. So I felt when I was going to translate this piece that I needed to go and really get to know the place and the people of Fanny's time. And then also, because this book is it's set in a few different time frames. It's set in the modern time, which would be more or less the 1850s, but the story with Mademoiselle de Malepeire takes place on the eve of the French Revolution. So those were 2 moments in time that I felt I needed to go and explore and make sure I understood the political movements, the people, the feeling, in order to get it right. And then also translating a book that was published 167 years ago for an audience today, English, right? English American speakers, required me to think of what would be familiar to a reader today. And as you mentioned earlier, that's why I added endnotes, because I didn't want them to be obtrusive and have footnotes at the bottom of each page and distract from the text, but I also felt that it was important for a reader today to be able to understand some of these literary references or some of these allusions. So for example, if I can go to the next slide here, here we go. Mademoiselle de Malepeire reads banned books. She reads Rousseau, she reads the Abbé Raynal, she reads Clarissa, which was translated into French from English. So these were scandalous titles at the time, but today I think unless you have a deep familiarity with French literature or banned books, you're not going to get that reference. You may have heard of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but maybe you've never read anything by him, or you may not know that his books were banned. So that is why those footnotes appear, to give the reader a sense of this is why this is a big deal. And this is why Mademoiselle de Malepeire casts the book aside and hopes that nobody notices that she was reading it, or looks at what page she was on. So that required, and that was a bit of for me, a bit of a struggle, because I didn't want it to be obtrusive, because that is another sin that Nabokov talks about, is when the author inserts, excuse me, the translator, which in this case would be me, inserts their own style onto that of the original text. And Randy, as you pointed out, you went back to the original and concluded that the original French was quite clear. So I feel like in that sense, maybe I achieved that goal. Because she is, I hate to use the word sparkling, but I'm going to. Her prose sparkles, and she is capable, at least in my opinion, to use an economy of words in such a way as to convey a place without going overboard. I mean, you know, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have George Sand, who will devote paragraphs to describing the rocky enclave with the convent and the wind and the color of the stones, and Fanny does that too, to an extent, but with much fewer words, which I appreciate.
Yeah, when I was reading it in English, I was always, because I'd gotten into this notion it's a translation, and I was trying to think, how in the heck could you have, what would that have been in French? Like there was one I passed out, but you may have even better examples. He's got Frédéric. This is the young man describing Marion, who was his uncle's trusted servant. He says she was the most hideous creature I had ever laid eyes upon. She was, for whatever reason, such a sour-tempered, sorry excuse for an old woman that looking at her produced an overwhelming sense of revulsion within me. Indeed, she reminded me of a vampire or a ghoul, with her long, stiff waist, her bony hands, her bulging red eyes, and the countless wrinkles that furrowed across her forehead. And I thought that couldn't be said in French. And sure enough, it was.
It really was. And you're actually bringing up another wonderful point, is that sometimes translators will get embarrassed. Maybe not today, maybe earlier translators, and actually in this case, I'll get to that, but what is in the original maybe might make somebody reading it today blush. And the translator may decide, well, maybe that's not what they really meant to write. Maybe they meant to say something else. For example, later in the book, Mademoiselle de Malepeire is with her husband, and her husband corrects her. He smacks her across the face for an infraction, and she swears at him. And I won't say it here, but she does. She swears at him. She swears at him in French, and I included it. And interestingly, as part of the translation work, I went to look at other previous translations of this, because the book has been translated. It's been plagiarized as well, but it's also been translated. And the most recent translation into English in the United States was in 1905 by a man named Remus Foster, about whom I can find absolutely nothing except for a review in the New York Times announcing his translation. But I found the translation itself, and I wanted to see how he handled it, because I was curious. And it didn't happen. She didn't say anything.
She didn't swear?
She didn't say anything. She just kind of took the hit and went upstairs. Like, it completely changes the way you read it, because that is a pivotal moment for her. Again, without giving too much away, this moment leads to a much more dramatic moment in the pages to come. So I felt that not including that is not a service, is a disservice to the modern reader.
Yeah.
So that's not unusual. Another thing I noticed with earlier translations is if the translator didn't know the word, they just left it in French and italicized it and hoped that the reader would know it, which doesn't help if you don't know French, and doesn't make it particularly accessible.
It's a cop-out.
It's a bit of a cop-out. It's well, okay, so that's my interpretation of it. It could also be that the author, the translator, wants to retain some of the French je ne sais quoi, and keep it maybe a little exotic, and keeping words in italics makes it feel a little bit more elite. I don't know, it could be that as well, but it doesn't help if you don't know the word in English. And if you need to go and look it up, it's not a good translation.
Speaking of exotic, why, because I've read this, I think in your introduction, one of the early translations was into Syrian. What was the connection and why?
Why? Well, so it was published, translated into Arabic and published in Syria by a Syrian publisher whose name I can provide you with the notes afterwards if you'd like to go. So I don't want to say it wrong. But at the time in Syria, you had upper class women who were literate, who were becoming more literate, and who wanted to read books about women in other cultures, wanted to expand their horizons. And so the publisher picked up on that. So these women, not only were the upper class, they also had money to spend. So this was one of the first books to be translated into Syrian for that purpose, to reach a newly literate and interested audience.
Well, we're going to be running out of time. Do you have any other, but before I do you have any other projects in the works that we can look forward to?
Actually, so I might, if I can skip to the end here, I'm sorry, folks, so these are other translations. Actually, there it is right there. The third translation citation there. I can provide it to you later if you want. At the end here, so this, what is the next project? Is a little tantalizing. You'll notice the picture I provided is not actually what's in the folder, but this is from the Musée Paul Arbaud, which is a former private residence. It's a private museum and library in Aix-en-Provence, and it is one of, I think, 2 repositories. Duke University has a couple other letters, but they have about 160 documents in Fanny's hand or letters written to Fanny, which is tremendous. So my next project is to go and actually read these notes, which 19th century paleography. I've done it before in French. I translated a project for the NEH, some letters in French for correspondence for the Brownings, Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, and they corresponded with people in France. Reading the actual handwriting in 19th century French is a challenge. That's, to answer your question, long story short, that's what I'd like to do next, is to actually transcribe these materials and see what they say.
Well, Bill, that is something to look forward to. Listen, before we open this back to the audience, and I don't want to hog it, but one piece of your resume, I mean, you're more than just a writer, not just a writer, you're more than a writer. But I was very impressed with the fact that you are primarily responsible for creating a world languages program in Fairfax County, Virginia. One of the great Chicago Alliance projects that I've been involved with and very impressed with has been our 20-year plus partnership with the Chicago Public Schools on providing French enrichment for 6 of the high schools in the city. World languages is I think always endangered in the era of cost cutting with public education. What needs to be done? What do organizations like us? How can we help? And what did you do?
Well, so the job description was, if you like this job, you have to make it matter. Otherwise, you're out of a job. So, all right, cool, I'll do it. But when I got there, it was so dire. Another school was busing in the 3 students from their school to take Latin at our school because the other school had shut their program down. And what I found in my experience was that, especially with French and Latin, I know that there is a movement. Spanish is important. There's no doubt that Spanish is important. But there is this perception, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in my experience, that French and Latin are elite languages. They're precious. They're for, the high achievers. And I felt that in order for those programs to succeed, I needed to demystify that and say, no, it can be that, but it can be that for any language. And in fact, if you go and you learn French and Latin, you're opening yourself up to, one, your SAT scores are going to go up, so that always helps with some parents with Latin, for example. But reminding or maybe introducing people to the fact that French is maybe not the lingua franca like English is, but there's a whole world out there that is in French that is interesting and relevant. And what I used a lot was that there are some studies out there that say by 2050, French may be one of the most spoken languages. I think right now it's the 5th most spoken. But a lot of that is because of countries in Africa that use that where French is one of the major languages. So I think just getting people's minds around the fact that French is not just spoken in Paris, and it's not just spoken, next to the Eiffel Tower. but providing, and I think as the Alliance Française does, all the various chapters, authentic, real world examples of where French can be used, and showing people that you can use it in your jobs, you can use it in your personal lives. It's beyond asking where the bathroom is in French when you go to Paris. It can be, if you want to go into fashion, you want to go into art, you want to go into sciences. So that was a big part of that push. And also, as I mentioned, also using authentic materials. I hate to admit this, but I will. I really hardly ever used the textbooks because they were boring and they hadn't been updated since I was a student. Obviously for the grammar components sometimes, but you can teach all of that. And I think there needs to be a buy-in from teachers. Clearly I could go on this all day, so stop me whenever. But I found that teachers I was working with didn't necessarily want to make that step. And I think that that's a problem. And I'm still seeing it actually. My own daughter has been taking French at the Alliance Française in White Plains. And I thought she would continue with French through middle school and high school, for example. And her experience at the middle school with the introductory French was disappointing. The teacher kind of leaned on her to be the expert, but didn't challenge her. So she's going with Chinese, which is a totally different direction. But I think also, if people never use the language, that's okay. The fact that you're using your brain in a certain way to learn language, to acquire language, to practice the pronunciation, that has value. So I would use that. There have been studies about the importance of just learning a language just to activate your brain. So those are the sort of things that I would share with the parents, the students, and also the other teachers.
Yeah, I think one of the most successful pieces of our program, first of all, the kids that come from the high schools for the enrichment, this is what we do at the Alliance. We provide more oral instruction than they get in the classrooms. And then in the past few years, students, French students from the Lycée Français have come over as a service project. And it's been it's been fun to watch, because when actual teenagers are using this language, it apparently becomes much more important and relevant than when it's just your teachers.
Right. We do pen pals, that would help a lot. But it's consistent. You are your best cheerleader, and I think that that's important for teachers to remember. And I think the Alliance Française, all of the chapters, I think, do an excellent job on that.
That we have always thought, a museum of language. And I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us, and I appreciate the time that you spent translating this really, to me, new piece of work, and look forward to I'm looking at what you're reading now. There's no possible way I could read that handwriting. So I'm depending on you to make it accessible. And then I'm going to turn it back to Efren and Renee for audience participation. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thank you, Randy.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. We have a question from Jonathan Parts, who says, you mentioned in a footnote the convention at the time was to write C and then a dash, n'importe quelle lettre, instead of a city name to add realism. And so just curious how this would have been seen to add more realism than choosing a city name. And also, do you think that those first letters were suggestive to a particular city, or just were they random?
So I think the first question is, would it have lended a sense of realism if Fanny had actually put a city in? Of course it would have. But the custom at the time was simply not to do that. Also going back further, when you have some of these more philosophical elements or writings, writers would cover their tracks by creating a fictional town, sort of a wink nod. It's really about Paris, but we're going to call it Maris, or, you know, we're just going to do an M and a dash or whatever. And that was just to sort of skirt conventions and to maybe avoid being banned, which didn't always work. It probably would have. It was just a convention, so we kept it.
But it's a convention that still persists. I see it in modern novels all the time.
It does persist. For me, I don't like it. I'm just, and I'm with you. Just give me a name, give me a city, make it up. But on the flip side, there are other places in the book that I think a reader who has knowledge of that area would recognize as a real place. you know, and then also she mentions the Malepeire past. There is no such thing as a Malepeire past. She made it up. So why not just make up a town as well? I don't know. I also don't know what town or city she might be referring to. There's so many little hamlets and places. Could be anywhere. Worth a visit.
So in the end, it's, you know, it maybe achieved its purpose or at the time but
at the time a reader wouldn't have batted an eye. I just don't think it would have made, keep going. For us, we stop and we pause unless you're reading the other fiction where the name is withheld. Yeah.
I was sort of curious, have you ever wondered what it would be like if she could visit us here today, Fanny, and then what she might have to say about gender relations today? Is there a big, because that was a big part of her focus.
Yeah.
That's a two-part question. Have you ever fantasized about having her come here, sit with you, and then what would she have to say about gender relations specifically?
I think she would have been marvelous to discuss anything with. I mean, so for example, in the introduction for the book, there's Hans Christian Andersen talks about having met her and how wonderful she was and how nice she was when she corrected his French. What he leaves out was he had been accused of lifting significant portions of one of her books for one of his plays. And so was he going out of his way to be nice to her because maybe he hadn't properly attributed his work to her? I'm not sure, but beyond that, she was very gracious. She was up to date on world events. She spoke with him. I think she would have been wonderful to talk to. I think she lived at a time where what was expected of her and what she wanted to do were often at odds, at least in terms of public perception and just ability. I mean, she was constrained. She never remarried. She was never allowed to remarry. She was always married. So even though they were separated for most of their lives, although they did develop a working relationship later on, be that as it may. I would have loved to have known what that private life, that undocumented part of her life was like for her. And what would she have to say about today? Oh boy, what do we have to say about today? I can't get into that. I don't know. A lot to talk about, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was sort of a loaded question, but I thought I'd give it a try.
I wish I could answer. I don't know.
And I had the privilege of talking with Barbara in the green room, and she may not want to admit this, but she says even in this book that there seems to be a difference in the gender reactions to the story.
That was my experience, my beta testing experience, I guess you want to put it that way. Men, contemporary men who read the book, seemed to come out one way on their perception of the book. For example, their view of how Mademoiselle de Malepeire treated the men was very different from how the women felt Mademoiselle de Malepeire treated the men. A lot of questions I get from male readers are, how come she couldn't be nicer?
Well, or I think I said, I sure didn't see that coming. And you said several men, exactly. Whereas a lot of women said from the beginning, oh, I know how this is going to end.
Yeah. Maybe take an extended vacation, don't stay overnight. But it is nice in that sense that it does create a conversation among people that I think maybe with other books where it is clear cut what the author's intent or the author's point of view is, maybe doesn't allow it to happen. And here, I think we can have that conversation and it works. I will say that the female characters for Reybaud, not just in this book, but in others, they are always the ones who seem to have the power and at least seem to have the intellect. They know what's going on, and the men just seem to appear like satellites, but yet retain the majority of the power and influence on a woman's life. But that's a topic for another day.
We do have a, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we do have a another question from Jonathan Parts, who's saying, if there's time, could you please talk about in more detail, he was struck by the description of Marion mentioned earlier, And it seems to be gone back to several times. I know you touched on it and how kind of very detailed the description was. Is there more that you'd like to say about that?
About Marion. So I guess at this point, maybe we should share a little bit about what happens in the book. So one of the main characters, Frédéric, is a student who goes to visit his uncle in the south of France. He goes every summer for summer vacation, and he stays with his uncle. And while he's there, he happens to be 16, 17, and his uncle has a painting of this stunning woman from another era. Nobody knows where this painting came from. It's clearly an aristocrat, and Frédéric falls in love with the painting. He can't take his eyes off it. It becomes his obsession to find the story behind the painting. And one day, a longtime friend of Frédéric's uncle shows up. They had known each other in seminary. Frédéric's uncle had been in seminary, then the revolution hit and give that life up. So a friend comes to visit, who's a marquis, who's traveled the world. He's coming to visit his old friend. And as soon as he gets there, he sees the painting and says, "Oh my God, I was supposed to marry that woman. What a poisonous creature. She's hideous, but I can see Frédéric, she has already enchanted you with her poisonous eyes." And so from there, the story of the woman in the painting unravels, and we jump back in time to a few months before the French Revolution, now with the young Marquis going to meet his betrothed, the woman Mademoiselle de Malepeire, in the painting. So you have a lot of these descriptions of people. You have Marion, who is hideous beyond description. She's not even a human. She's a vampire. She's a ghoul. She's otherworldly in a negative way.
Red bulging eyes.
Excuse me?
She has red bulging eyes.
Red bulging eyes, right? There's nothing attractive about this woman. And then you have this woman in this painting who is otherworldly and yet angelic. She looks like these fanciful paintings that were very popular at the time of women in frilly dresses running around fields with flocks of sheep. I mean, you can probably envision, they're holding the hook and frilly, blonde, blue-eyed, all of that. And this dichotomy exists. So that's one example of where the description of the person is sort of, I guess, a mystery in a way. How are these two people related? It comes out eventually, but the descriptions of these people are not rooted in reality. These are descriptions based on the the desires, I guess, of a teenage boy. So and the other characters in the book are for example, the men, Don Virizac, Mademoiselle de Malpeire's husband later on, the Pinatel, the great peasant giant man. They're described in such a way that they seem more rooted in reality and yet otherworldly as well, but much more, you would recognize these people on the street. I hope that answers your question.
I think you just mentioned, and I don't think it's giving away too much, she rejects the Marquis, the aristocrat, and marries the local boy. I don't know if he was qualified as a rustique, but she married the big local boy instead.
She marries the Abba, the big local, yes, the strapping, handsome young colossus, bronzed and could, lift people up with his pinkies. And so that's who our Marquis is up against. He's aristocrat, refined. He has, delicate but charming features, but he's just not Mademoiselle's cup of tea.
Well, yeah, and there's where the modern comes in, because she doesn't say it, but you just think sex has a lot to do with this.
Yes. Actually, that goes back to the translation. There is a scene where she admits to being the lover of Pinatel, and it's, racy.
Yeah.
And in earlier translations, that got skipped. Like there's this much longer speech, whereas in the original, she just comes right out and says it. Like, yes, we're a couple, we're together. He comes over every night. You don't know. It's a lot more direct, but I think part of the beauty of this book is that Fanny keeps things going. You don't get a whole lot of time to stop and think and to digest what's going on. The action continues through the end, which I think for those of us who feel we don't have enough time sometimes to think, if you want to get through a book, this is an easy one to do. I hate to call it a beach read, but it does have that length going for it.
Well, it's a page turner, and you don't put it down easy, no doubt.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have time for one quick question. This may not be a quick question. James Harmon is asking, does anyone suggest that Zola, for whom X was important, was familiar with Fanny's work or life?
That's fascinating. I don't know, but it's possible. Obviously, he came later. It's hard to say. I don't know what he would have seen, what was available to him when he was writing. I have a sense, so not Zola, but Oscar Wilde, for example, was a huge Francophile, buried in France, lived in Paris, and you know, the story about Dorian Gray is a portrait paint. It's a portrait book. It's about looking into if you haven't read it, go read it. It's a great book to read and then come back to this, which was published obviously well after this one. And part of me wonders, did he read this? He could read French. I would suspect that perhaps he did, especially given the book about Dorian Gray. But for Zola, I'm making a note of that because I would love to find out more.
Well, I
I
can see Oscar Wilde reading it. I'm not sure that Zola would have appreciated it if he had read it. It's just not his style.
It's not his style. They're very different. But you know, we read widely. You never know.
Yeah.
Would he have used it to influence his work? No, I suspect that it's, as you say, Randy, very different.
So I think with that, it may be just about time to wrap up here. I don't see any, you know, we've got like 2 minutes. So is there anything else that you sort of would like to add?
I hope I didn't speak too fast. I hope.
Oh no,
folks. I could go on forever about Fanny and her early life, and I know it may seem irrelevant. What does it matter if her father was married to a doctor, if her grandfather was an emigre? But if you know this about her life, and then you go and read really what is her masterpiece, I think, given that there's so little that exists about Fanny's life, we do kind of get a portal into some of maybe what she was thinking and maybe what she was experiencing. Part of the literary device here of setting the book in the very distant past, right, in the time of the French Revolution, allows her to sort of have her characters express thoughts and sentiments that maybe if they were expressed in a more contemporary setting might have landed her in some hot water.
And I think, Barbara, that leads to my final question. Have you ever thought of, I mean, you do such a beautiful job of the historic work. You ever tempted to translate something from a modern writer?
No.
Okay.
I have not, but there's a lot of people who specialize in that. I like this stuff. What can I tell you?
There's a question that I think you ought to answer before we leave, Renee.
Yes.
Peggy asked, where can you buy the books?
The book is available. Is there? I mean, Barbara likes to direct people to independent bookstores. So just because they need our support,
It's available everywhere.
Yeah, but it's available everywhere.
And Kindle, the Kindle, I have to say, I was really, Bancroft Press really made a lovely Kindle edition if you want to read it sooner. During the pandemic, that was the only version available, which actually I enjoyed because I hadn't seen it in Kindle. And when you click on the footnote, it takes you directly to the footnote, or excuse me, the endnote, and then you click on it again. Yeah. My first experience with endnotes, go figure. It's seamless. You don't have to go all the way to the back of the book and find it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. Well, thank you. Merci beaucoup, Barbara and Randy, and thank you to everyone for coming today. Be sure to check out our upcoming book discussion group, The Making of Paris. It's happening this Thursday at 4 Central Daylight Time. You don't need to have necessarily read the book. Also, just check our website. If you could, please, everyone, please unmute your microphones to applaud. It's just so wonderful. We've had a wonderful time.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your morning with me. This has been wonderful. I
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you very much.
enjoyed this. I hope.
Merci.
Yes.
Merci.
Bravo.
Merci,
Je suis dans le
merci.
caboose.
Merci.